Imagine standing on a crowded train platform, the air filled with the cries of children clutching small suitcases, their faces pressed against the glass as they wave goodbye to parents they may never see again. In that moment, a single decision could mean life or death. And yet, one man, a quiet stockbroker from London, chose to intervene, rewriting the destiny of hundreds of children who otherwise would have been lost to history. This is not the story of a soldier or a general, but of a civilian whose courage shone in the darkest days of the 20th century. His name was Nicholas Winton. Born in Hampstead, London in 1909, Nicholas Winton came from a family of German Jewish heritage that had settled in Britain. His parents, having converted to Christianity, gave him every opportunity for a comfortable upbringing. He attended private schools, traveled widely, and developed a keen interest in finance. By the 1930s, he had established himself as a young stockbroker with a promising future. Outwardly, he seemed destined for a life of quiet prosperity. Yet beneath the calm surface, Winton carried a restless spirit, a conviction that personal success meant little if the world around him collapsed into despair. That conviction would be tested in late 1938, a time when Europe teetered on the edge of catastrophe. The Munich Agreement had just allowed Adolf Hitler to annex the Sudetenland, a heavily German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. For much of the Western world, it seemed like a diplomatic victory. Peace for our time, as British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously declared. But for those living in Czechoslovakia, the agreement was a death knell. Thousands of Jewish families, as well as political opponents of the Nazis, suddenly found themselves trapped, marked for persecution. Refugee camps swelled almost overnight, filled with people who sensed what was coming long before the world would acknowledge it. It was in this climate that Nicholas Winton received a call from a friend working with refugees in Prague. Winton had planned a holiday to Switzerland, but instead he made a detour to Czechoslovakia. What he saw would change his life forever. Arriving in Prague, he was confronted with the raw reality of displacement. Families crammed into makeshift shelters, children without proper clothing, parents desperate for a way out. Unlike diplomats or politicians, Winton had no official authority, but what he did have was determination and an instinct for organization that would soon prove invaluable. He began by asking a simple question: what could be done for the children? Adults, he realized, faced insurmountable obstacles to emigration, as most countries had already tightened their borders against Jewish refugees. But perhaps children could be moved more easily. Britain had recently passed a policy known as the Kindertransport, allowing Jewish children from Germany and Austria to enter the country temporarily. However, no such program yet existed for Czechoslovakia. Winton decided to create one from scratch. Back in his small hotel room in Prague, he set up what would later be called an office, using nothing more than a typewriter, paper, and a telephone. He began compiling lists of children whose families were willing to send them abroad. Parents lined up for hours, hoping that their child's name might make it onto his growing registry. These were not casual decisions. Each parent knew that putting their child on Winton's list meant a possible permanent separation. And yet, faced with the alternative of Nazi persecution, many chose to take the risk. When Winton returned to London, he carried not only those lists, but also the immense responsibility they represented. He had to navigate a maze of bureaucracy to turn his plan into reality. The British government required guarantees. Each child needed a host family willing to provide care and a deposit to cover expenses. Without these assurances, no visas would be granted. Most would have given up in the face of such obstacles. But Winton launched a campaign from his dining room table, enlisting friends and colleagues to help him raise funds and find foster homes. He advertised in newspapers, visited churches and synagogues, and appealed to anyone who might open their door to a refugee child. It was a race against time. Every day, Nazi influence spread deeper into Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, Hitler broke the Munich Agreement entirely by occupying the rest of the country. Prague fell under direct Nazi control, and the danger to Jewish families escalated sharply. For Winton, the urgency became almost unbearable. He redoubled his efforts, arranging train departures from Prague that would carry children across Germany and into the relative safety of the Netherlands, from where ferries would take them to England. Each train required meticulous planning, permissions from multiple governments, tickets, escorts, and above all, the courage of families to place their children on board. The first transports were small, just a few dozen children at a time, but soon the numbers grew. Winton personally oversaw the logistics, working late into the night after his day job at the stock exchange. He created dossiers for each child, complete with photographs, background information, and potential placements with host families in Britain. His work became so extensive that it rivaled the scale of official refugee organizations, though he remained simply a private citizen. By the summer of 1939, several trains had already brought hundreds of children safely to Britain. Each arrival was both a triumph and a heartbreak, young faces peering from train windows, uncertain but hopeful, while behind them parents stood weeping on the platforms, their hands raised in final farewells. For many of those parents, those goodbyes would indeed be final. And yet, through all of this, Nicholas Winton never sought recognition. He did not see himself as a hero, but as a man doing what needed to be done. He spoke little of his efforts, even to close friends. To him, the true measure of success was simple: how many children could be saved before the borders closed, before war engulfed all of Europe. As the summer wore on, the shadow of conflict grew darker. News from Germany grew more ominous with each passing week. Rumors of invasion circulated constantly. Winton continued to arrange trains, pushing against bureaucratic delays, financial hurdles, and the sheer chaos of a continent on the brink of war. And always, he carried the weight of knowing that each delay might mean the difference between life and death for a child on his list. This first stage of Winton's mission was a battle fought not with weapons, but with papers, stamps, and signatures. It was the quiet struggle of one man against indifference and inertia, fueled by the conviction that even in the face of overwhelming evil, one person's determination could tip the balance. The world did not yet know his name, and the children boarding those trains could not have imagined the scope of the rescue effort being orchestrated on their behalf. But history would one day remember Nicholas Winton as the man who, against all odds, gave hundreds of children a chance to live. By the spring of 1939, Nicholas Winton's operation had grown into something almost unthinkable for a man working from a small house in Hampstead. His dining table had become a command center, piled with stacks of documents, applications, letters from desperate parents, and photographs of children who gazed up with eyes that seemed to ask a single question: "Will you save me?" Every day, the telephone rang with inquiries from both sides of the channel. Families in Prague begged for news, while in Britain, potential foster parents needed reassurance that they could make a difference. Winton became the bridge between these two worlds, a lifeline stretched across a continent sinking deeper into peril. The logistics were staggering. Each child needed a visa from the Home Office, proof of sponsorship, medical records, and transportation. British officials, wary of being overwhelmed by refugees, insisted on strict rules. No child could enter without full documentation and a guarantee of financial support. To a bureaucrat, these were numbers on a page. To Winton, each name on his list was a living soul running out of time, And so he refused to be slowed by red tape. He cajoled, persuaded, and when necessary, bent the rules by moving paperwork faster than the authorities might have liked. But even as he fought battles with British bureaucracy, there was the far more dangerous task of getting the children out of Prague. This meant negotiating with railway companies, securing permits from German officials, and ensuring safe passage across occupied territory. Every train was a gamble, one wrong document, one suspicious officer, and the entire group could be turned back. Winton worked tirelessly with local contacts in Prague, including a small but dedicated network of volunteers who arranged escorts, gathered children at departure points, and managed the heartbreaking moments when parents let go of their sons and daughters. Among the first to step forward as a host in Britain were families from all walks of life: teachers, shopkeepers, farmers, even aristocrats. Some took in a single child, others several. For many hosts, this decision was an act of compassion rooted in faith or humanitarian principle. For others, it was simply a recognition that these were innocent children caught in a storm not of their making. Whatever the reasons, the generosity of these British households became the cornerstone of Winton's mission. Without them, the visas would have been worthless. The children themselves arrived bewildered, carrying what little they could fit into a small case or bundle. Some clutched toys, others photographs of their parents. Many had been instructed to memorize addresses, to write letters home if possible, though in time the letters would stop. For now, however, there was relief, even joy. They were safe, and in the arms of strangers who would soon become surrogate families. Winton personally met several of the arriving trains, though he preferred to remain in the background, watching from the platform as children were reunited with their new guardians. He often said later that the real heroes were not himself, but the families who opened their doors. As the months passed, the scope of the operation grew. By July 1939, 8 transports had successfully carried children from Prague to London. Each one was a victory against the tide of despair sweeping across Europe. Yet even with these successes, the list of children waiting remained painfully long. For every child placed on a train, dozens more were still in Prague, their parents anxiously awaiting word. Winton's volunteers worked day and night, processing applications, matching children to hosts, and preparing the next departure. The pressure was relentless, but so too was their determination. Then came September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and 2 days later, Britain declared war. The fragile network Winton had built collapsed almost overnight. Borders closed, travel became impossible, and the last train, scheduled to leave Prague on September 3rd, with more than 200 children on board, was abruptly cancelled. For the families who had packed bags and said their goodbyes, the blow was devastating. Many of those children would never leave occupied Europe. For Winton, the news was a dagger to the heart. He knew what their fate would likely be, but he also knew he could not allow himself to drown in despair. He had already saved hundreds. That had to be his focus. In total, 669 children had reached Britain through Winton's initiative. Each one represented a triumph of perseverance over indifference. Yet the story was far from finished. For Winton himself, the outbreak of war meant new responsibilities. No longer just a stockbroker, he was soon enlisted in the Royal Air Force, where he served as an officer. Even there, amid the chaos of global conflict, he rarely spoke of his rescue mission. To those around him, he seemed like any other serviceman. The truth of what he had done lay quietly in boxes of papers and photographs stored away in his home, gathering dust. For the children, meanwhile, the journey of survival had only just begun. Life in Britain was not always easy. Some adapted quickly, learning English, excelling in school, and bonding with their foster families. Others struggled with loneliness, trauma, and the gnawing uncertainty about their parents' fate. Letters from Czechoslovakia became fewer, then stopped altogether as Nazi repression tightened its grip. Slowly, painfully, the realization dawned on many that their mothers and fathers were gone, swallowed by the camps that spread like shadows across occupied Europe. And yet, through the grief, there was resilience. Many of these children would grow up to contribute greatly to British society and beyond. They became teachers, doctors, artists, and scientists. Some even played roles in shaping post-war Europe, carrying with them the unshakable memory of the man who had given them a chance to live. Nicholas Winton, however, remained almost entirely unknown. He did not trumpet his achievements or seek the spotlight. To him, the war years were defined more by what he could not accomplish than by what he had. The train that never left Prague haunted him, the faces of those 200 children lingering like ghosts in the recesses of his mind. He went on with his life quietly, marrying, raising a family, and working in various charitable organizations. To most who knew him, he was simply a modest, kind man with a sharp mind and a strong moral compass. The world moved on, the war ended, Europe rebuilt, and the atrocities of the Holocaust entered the history books. For decades, Winton's name was absent from those pages. He made no effort to change that. It was not until the 1980s, more than 40 years later, that the story of the 669 children he had saved would finally emerge, astonishing even those closest to him. But that part of the story belongs to later chapters. For now, what mattered was the fragile miracle of survival. Against a backdrop of rising tyranny, one man had seen the suffering of children and chosen to act, not because he was compelled by government or command, but because conscience demanded it. His story is a reminder that heroism is often quiet, unassuming, and carried out in the shadows where few ever look. Nicholas Winton's battle was waged not with bullets or bombs, but with documents, signatures, and the relentless belief that one life saved was worth any effort. The war had ended, leaving Europe scarred and broken. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and the world struggled to process the magnitude of the horrors that had unfolded. For Nicholas Winton, now back in civilian life, the chapter of frantic train schedules and refugee lists seemed like a distant memory. He had carried out his duty in the Royal Air Force, returned to work, married his wife Greta, and built a quiet family life. To his friends, neighbors, and even his children, he was simply Nicky, a kind, modest man with a gentle sense of humor and a strong devotion to charitable causes. The events in Prague in 1939 were never discussed. This silence was not unusual. Many who lived through the war chose to set aside their memories, focusing instead on rebuilding and moving forward. For Winton, the memories of the hundreds of children he had saved were always overshadowed by those he could not. The cancelled train of September 1939 haunted him. While others might have worn their achievements as badges of honor, Winton carried his as unfinished business, tinged with sorrow. To him there was no glory in saving some if others had been left behind, and so the story remained untold. The documents that could have revealed his actions, lists of children, letters from parents, photographs carefully attached to index cards, were tucked away in boxes in his attic. For decades they gathered dust. He never mentioned them to colleagues or acquaintances. Even his wife Greta knew only fragments of the story. When she asked, he would brush it aside, insisting it was not important. The war had produced countless acts of bravery, he said. His contribution was nothing special. Meanwhile, the children he had saved grew up. They became part of Britain's post-war fabric, scattered across the country, building lives that might otherwise have been cut short. Some assimilated so fully that their refugee origins became a faint echo. Others carried their identity more visibly, becoming advocates for remembrance, determined that the tragedies of their childhood not be forgotten. Many of them assumed the man who had organized their escape was long gone or simply lost to history. Few knew that the man who had once scribbled their names on lists was living quietly in the English countryside, content to remain anonymous. The rediscovery of Nicholas Winton's story came almost by accident. In the early 1980s, Greta was cleaning the attic of their home when she came across an old briefcase filled with papers. Inside were meticulous records, photographs of children, correspondence with British officials, visas and train schedules. It was, in essence, the archive of his mission. Stunned, Greta pressed her husband for details. At first, Winton resisted. It had been over 40 years, and he still believed it was not worth mentioning. But Greta disagreed. She understood that what lay in that briefcase was not just paperwork, but evidence of one of the most remarkable civilian rescue efforts of the war. Greta shared the documents with a Holocaust researcher and journalist. Soon after, Winton's story began to surface in articles and interviews. The scale of his operation, the number of lives saved, and the fact that he had kept it secret for so long, captured public imagination. Yet, the true revelation came in 1988, when Winton was invited to appear on the BBC television programme That's Life, a popular show that often mixed light-hearted features with extraordinary human interest stories. On that evening, Winton sat quietly in the studio audience, unassuming as ever. The host began recounting his story, explaining how, as a young man, he had saved 669 children from Nazi persecution. Winton listened with his usual modesty, perhaps expecting nothing more than polite applause. But then came the twist. The host asked, "Is there anyone in the audience tonight who owes their life to Nicholas Winton?" To his astonishment, people around him began to stand. One by one, dozens of men and women rose to their feet, adults now, but once children who had travelled on those trains he had organized. Winton looked around, his eyes wide, overcome by emotion. Tears welled as he realized the living legacy of what he had done. In that studio, the faces of the children he had saved, now parents and even grandparents themselves, surrounded him. The audience erupted in applause, and for once, Nicholas Winton could not hide in anonymity. The broadcast electrified viewers across Britain. Letters poured in, journalists clamoured for interviews, and historians scrambled to piece together the details of Winton's mission. Overnight, he became known as the British Schindler, a title he never claimed for himself, but which helped the wider public grasp the magnitude of his actions. For Winton, the attention was both humbling and uncomfortable. He had lived for decades without recognition and had never sought it. Yet now the world insisted on acknowledging him. The children he had saved, often referred to as the Winton's children, formed their own network of remembrance. Many had grown into accomplished figures, doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists, and public servants. They carried within them a shared bond, a silent acknowledgement that their lives had been spared, because one man refused to look away in 1939. Their gratitude spilled forth in letters and visits. For some, meeting Winton again was a chance to close a circle that had remained open since the day they boarded those trains. As the 1990s unfolded, Nicholas Winton's story spread beyond Britain. He was honoured in the Czech Republic, where memorials were erected to commemorate the children rescued from Prague. In Israel, he was recognised by Yad Vashem, though his case was somewhat unusual since he was not Jewish and had never directly risked his life under Nazi control. Nevertheless, the moral courage he displayed was undeniable. Honours accumulated, knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II, the Order of the White Lion from the Czech president, and statues erected in Prague and London. And yet, despite the accolades, Winton remained consistent in his humility. When asked why he had done it, he would reply simply, "Because it was the right thing to do." He never romanticized his role, never suggested he was extraordinary. To him, the tragedy was not that he had saved hundreds, but that thousands more had been left behind. He carried that weight to the end of his life. The rediscovery of his story also reignited discussions about responsibility. Winton's actions stood in sharp contrast to the indifference shown by many governments and institutions during the pre-war years. His example raised uncomfortable questions. If one young stockbroker with no authority or resources could save 669 children, why had so many nations with power and influence done so little? Winton himself rarely dwelled on such debates, but historians and ethicists could not ignore the implications. The children who had once stepped onto those trains now carried the torch of his memory. They became living proof that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, one person's determination could ripple across generations. Each wedding, each graduation, each new birth in their families became part of Nicholas Winton's legacy. As his story became widely known, documentaries were filmed, books written, and classrooms across the world began teaching his example. The quiet man, who had once dismissed his deeds as unimportant, was now recognized as one of the great moral figures of the 20th century. And yet, even in his later years, when asked about his legacy, Winton would smile modestly and say, "If it's not impossible, then surely it can be done." By the time Nicholas Winton entered his 90s, he had already lived through nearly a century of change. He had seen the world collapse into war, recover, and then race into a modern age of technology and globalization. Yet, wherever he went, he carried himself with the same modesty that had defined him since his youth. He never considered himself a hero, even as the world increasingly celebrated him as one. The 1990s and early 2000s brought a wave of recognition that Winton could never have anticipated. Statues were unveiled in his honor at train stations in London and Prague, showing him holding the hand of a child, a reminder of the desperate journeys he once organized. He traveled abroad to receive awards, often accompanied by some of the children he had saved, now grandparents themselves. These events were emotional reunions, filled with gratitude and reverence, but Winton always deflected praise. "Don't call me a hero," he would often say. "I only did what needed to be done." In interviews, he displayed a sharp wit, even in his advanced age. Asked how he managed to stay so healthy past his 100th birthday, he replied dryly that he had been fortunate not to have been caught by anything yet. But beneath the humor was a deeper philosophy. Winton believed strongly in the power of individual responsibility. When pressed on why he had risked so much in 1939, he answered simply, "Because it was the right thing to do. If something is not impossible, there must be a way to do it." These words became a kind of motto, a distillation of his belief that obstacles were challenges to be worked through, not excuses for inaction. His story was particularly powerful because it stood as a counterpoint to the indifference of many governments during the pre-war years. Winton's private determination had achieved what entire nations failed to attempt. While diplomats debated and politicians hesitated, a young stockbroker used ingenuity, personal sacrifice, and sheer persistence to cut through bureaucracy. Historians pointed out that this contrast was uncomfortable, but necessary. Winton himself never accused others, but the implications were clear. Silence and inaction can be as dangerous as cruelty. As global awareness of the Holocaust grew in the late 20th century, Winton's story became an educational tool. Teachers used it to show students that history was not only shaped by generals and politicians, but also by ordinary civilians who refused to ignore suffering. Documentaries portrayed his life, focusing not only on the rescue missions, but on the decades of silence that followed, emphasizing how true virtue often hides in humility. The children he had saved, by then scattered across Britain, Israel, the United States, and beyond, often described him as a second father. They invited him to family celebrations, introducing him to grandchildren who existed only because of his actions. Winton would attend quietly, smiling at the noise of large families, but always downplaying his role. He never wanted thanks, insisting that the real credit belonged to those who worked alongside him in Prague, the parents who had trusted strangers with their children, and the countless volunteers who provided shelter in Britain. Still, the families could not help but see him as the root of their survival. In 2002, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him for services to humanity. Standing before royalty, Winton accepted the honor with the same humility that marked all his public appearances. For him, recognition was never the goal. He had lived most of his life without it, and if the world had never discovered his story, he would have been content. But as he accepted the knighthood, he also recognized that the attention gave his story new power. It served as an example for future generations, a reminder of what one person can accomplish when guided by conscience. That same year, the Czech Republic awarded him the Order of the White Lion, its highest honor. He stood on the balcony of Prague Castle beside the president, looking out over a city he had last seen in 1939. For Winton, the moment was bittersweet. The children he saved were proof of hope, but the memory of those who had been left behind never left him. He admitted privately that he often thought of the train that never departed, the one scheduled for September 1939, which had been cancelled after Germany invaded Poland. Nearly 250 children were on that list, and most of them perished. That single train haunted him more than all the successful journeys he had organized. Even in his old age, Winton's mind returned to that unanswered question. Why hadn't more been done? He expressed frustration at the bureaucratic obstacles of the time, the endless paperwork that slowed down visas and prevented more children from leaving. For him, the lesson was clear. Humanitarian action must never be shackled by excessive caution or indecision. When lives are at stake, action must come first. As the new millennium began, Winton became a figure of inspiration beyond the world of history. Universities invited him to speak. Humanitarian organizations cited him as a moral example, and young activists quoted his words in their campaigns. His story circulated on the internet, reaching audiences who had never heard of the Kindertransports. Clips of his tearful reunion on That's Life went viral decades later, reminding millions of viewers around the world that courage can be quiet, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are those who never sought recognition. Despite his fame, Winton lived simply. He remained in his family home, maintaining close relationships with his children and grandchildren. His personal habits were unpretentious, his humor intact. Friends often remarked on his refusal to let attention change him. Even as a centenarian, he was approachable and warm, more interested in hearing about the lives of others than discussing his own past. In 2014, on his 105th birthday, he was celebrated once again in Prague, where surviving Winton's children gathered with their families to honor him. Photographs from that day show him seated in a wheelchair, smiling gently, surrounded by generations who traced their existence back to his courage. His health was frail, but his spirit was steady. A year later, in 2015, Nicholas Winton passed away peacefully, leaving behind not only a legacy of lives saved, but also a philosophy that would outlive him, that doing what is right often begins with a single person deciding not to look away. His funeral was attended by family, dignitaries, and many of the children he had once rescued. Tributes poured in from across the world. Politicians, educators, and ordinary citizens alike expressed their admiration. Yet perhaps the most profound tribute came not in speeches or ceremonies, but in the continued lives of those he saved. Each family gathering, each new birth, each milestone achieved by Winton's children carried his legacy forward. Nicholas Winton never considered himself extraordinary, but in a century marked by both devastating cruelty and astonishing acts of humanity, his story stands as a reminder of what is possible when conscience overrules complacency. He proved that courage does not always roar on the battlefield. Sometimes it works quietly in offices and train stations, filling out forms and finding homes for strangers. His life invites each of us to ask, when faced with injustice, will we remain silent or will we act? Nicholas Winton A.S. death in July 2015 marked the end of a life that had stretched across more than a century, but in many ways it was also the beginning of a new chapter in his story. Far from fading with time, his example has only grown more powerful in the years since his passing. For those who knew him personally, and for the hundreds of families whose very existence depended on his actions, he was more than a historical figure. He was proof that moral courage is timeless. In the days after his passing, tributes came from around the world. Newspapers in Britain, the Czech Republic, Israel, and the United States carried front-page stories about the man who had organized one of the most successful rescue operations of the Second World War. World leaders offered condolences, describing him as a symbol of compassion and bravery. Yet beyond the official words and ceremonies, the most moving tributes came from Winton's children themselves. They gathered to speak not only of what he had done, but of what it had meant for their own families. Without him, they explained, their children and grandchildren would never have existed. His legacy was not written in medals or titles, but in generations of lives that flourished because of his refusal to look away in 1939. Over time, his story has taken root in collective memory. In Prague, the city where his mission began, statues of Winton now stand as daily reminders to commuters and tourists alike. One shows him on a station platform with a child's suitcase, gazing into the distance as if waiting for the train that would carry hope to safety. Another, erected at Liverpool Street Station in London, depicts children descending from a train, representing the arrival of refugees who had escaped because of his efforts. These monuments are not grand or imposing. They are quiet, much like the man himself, inviting passers-by to reflect on what one ordinary person can achieve in extraordinary circumstances. Schools across Europe and beyond have adopted his story as part of their curriculum. Teachers use it to introduce students to the concept of moral responsibility. It is not taught as a tale of heroism in the traditional sense, but as a lesson that history is shaped not only by leaders and armies, but also by individuals who decide to act when others hesitate. Students are encouraged to consider what they would do in similar situations, to think about what it means to act with conscience in their own lives. In Israel, his name is spoken with reverence among communities that honor the memory of those lost in the Holocaust. Although Winton himself was not Jewish, the fact that he devoted his energy to saving Jewish children resonates deeply. His story underscores the idea that compassion transcends boundaries of religion, nationality, and culture. When asked about his motivations, he always answered simply, he saw children in danger and felt compelled to help. That clarity, stripped of ideology or self-interest, is part of what makes his story so powerful. In popular culture, his life has inspired documentaries, books, and even films. Each new retelling introduces him to a wider audience. The 2011 film Nicky's Family combined historical footage with interviews of survivors and their descendants, showing the ripple effect of his actions across decades. More recently, dramatizations of his story have reached global audiences, ensuring that younger generations, far removed from the events of the 1930s, can still connect with his example. Clips of his 1988 television reunion continue to circulate online, watched by millions who may know nothing about the Kindertransports, but are deeply moved by the moment when he first realized the full extent of his legacy. But perhaps the most enduring part of Winton's story is the philosophy it represents. He was never comfortable with being called a hero because, to him, what he did should not have been exceptional. It should have been normal. His life challenges us to reconsider what we expect of ourselves and others. Too often, people dismiss their ability to make a difference by assuming problems are too large or that someone else will act. Winton's example refutes this. He showed that even a single person, without authority, wealth, or power, can reshape the lives of hundreds simply by refusing to accept inaction. In a world that continues to face humanitarian crises, refugees fleeing conflict, children displaced by war, families separated by violence, his story remains painfully relevant. Governments debate, policies stall, and yet the lesson of Winton is clear. While bureaucracy argues, lives are lost. He would not have wanted his name to be used merely for commemoration. He would have wanted it to serve as a call to action. "Don't be content with just talking about it," he once remarked. "Do something." For the families who trace their lineage back to him, that call is personal. Reunions of Winton's children still take place, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, each gathering a living testament to what he accomplished. They share stories of their parents' journeys, the letters their grandparents wrote begging for help, and the chance Nicholas Winton gave them to survive. These reunions are filled not with solemnity, but with joy. The laughter of children playing, the chatter of cousins meeting for the first time, the noise of generations that exist because one man cared enough to act. Historians often struggle with the tension between remembering the horrors of the past and celebrating the acts of goodness that arose in response. Winton's story helps bridge that gap. It does not erase the suffering of those who were lost, nor does it diminish the enormity of the Holocaust. Instead, it shines a light on a truth too often overlooked, that even amid the darkest moments of history, there were individuals who chose decency over despair. His life reminds us that the past is not only a record of destruction, but also of resilience, compassion, and moral courage. When Nicholas Winton passed away at the age of 106, he left behind no fortune, no empire, no grand institution bearing his name. What he left was more profound, a living legacy of lives saved, and an idea that continues to inspire. His story invites each of us to reflect on the choices we make, large and small. Do we act when we see injustice? Do we intervene when others suffer? Do we use the resources we have, no matter how limited, to make a difference? For Winton, these questions were never theoretical. They were urgent, immediate, and demanded action. The children in Prague had no time for debate, and so he did not waste time debating. He acted. The lesson is as relevant today as it was in 1939. In the quiet corners of train stations, in classrooms where his story is told, in family homes where generations gather, Nicholas Winton's presence endures. He lives not in statues or medals, but in the values he embodied: humility, responsibility, and the belief that if something is not impossible, then it must be possible. His life, once hidden in the shadows of history, now shines brightly across the world. And as long as his story is remembered, the message will remain clear. One person can make a difference. One person can change the course of countless lives. One person can stand against indifference. Nicholas Winton was that person. And his example challenges us all to ask, with honesty and urgency, when the moment comes, will we be that person too?